How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Bill in Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Roger in Philly, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, Belle in Texas, Renee in Indiana, Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Joseph in Sierra Nevada, Michael in Anderson, Indiana. Would love for the movie to make it to Indy. We're trying. It's going to take time. But whether it makes it to a theater near you or not, in good time, and hopefully not too long, it'll come to streaming across the world. So over there on the YouTube side, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City, Marie in Freeport, New York. All right, not such a short daf today, so let's get into it. Our daf is page 36 here in Tractate Avodah Zarah, the 27th volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 2, talking about items that belong or come from the possession of idolaters, which are going to be prohibited for consumption. Therefore, we're talking about some kind of a food that is prohibited for consumption, but may be permitted for benefit, meaning a Jew could buy and sell this product even though he can't eat it. This is a less stringent prohibition than the substances we talked about, like the wine of idolaters, which we're not allowed to drink, we can't consume it, nor can we benefit from it. Okay, bottom of page 35b. Our Mishnah number 5, taught, and their oil, right, the oil of idolaters, was originally prohibited, but later it was permitted by Rebbe and his court. So the Gemara cites a dispute with regard to the origin of the prohibition of oil. Oil generally means olive oil. So why would the olive oil of idolaters be prohibited? It's not that they're going to use it as part of a libation for idolatrous sacrifices. Oil wasn't used in that way. So what's going on with the oil? So Rav says that Daniel as in Daniel, the prophet Daniel, the book of Daniel, decreed that oil is prohibited. And Shmuel says, right, so it was decreed all the way back in the book of Daniel that the oil of idolaters is prohibited based on this view. And Shmuel, so Shmuel is a sage from the period of the Gemara in Bavel, in Babylonia. And now we're at the top of page 36a. Shmuel says, the secretion of ritually pure vessels prohibits the oil that the idolaters pour into them. Now this seems to suggest that, well, what do they store their oil in? Vessels that might have held wine. And wine is so prohibited, the wine of idolaters, because they use it in idolatrous rituals, that any liquid, presumably, of idolaters that has value, and that therefore they would store carefully, similar to wine, they might come to store in the same vessels, and therefore, because of the residue of the wine in those vessels that mixes with the oil, we're going to render the oil prohibited, right? That seems to be the view here. And the Gemara asks, is that to say that all people are consumed? Now, I'm sorry. That was, what I just said is with regard to idolatry. That's not what he's saying. He said the secretion of ritually impure vessels. What I just said we'll come back to momentarily. This is something different. So ritually impure vessels means vessels that have some kind of tuma about them, that the vessel has come into contact with a substance that was rendered ritually impure. It is tameh. Now, where does tuma matter? We know that if a person or an object is tameh, he cannot, or the object cannot enter the courtyards of the Holy Temple when the Holy Temple is standing. Or a Kohen, a priest, who receives teruma, the tithe, the part of the tithing process that is given to priests, the descendants of Aaron, both the teruma and the Kohen have to be tahor, in a state of ritual purity, not tameh, ritually impure, both the teruma and the kohen have to be in a state of ritual purity. Both have to be tahor for the priest to eat the teruma. If either the teruma has become tameh, ritually impure, or the priest is tameh, he can't eat that food. So now what they're saying is, okay, the vessels of the idolaters, because they don't really care about ritual impurity, their laws have nothing to do with ritual purity and impurity. This has nothing to do with hygiene or germs or illness, nothing at all, right? It's just that the Torah tells us that there are certain things like a dead body, like blood, especially of a menstruating woman, like a man who's had, a seminal discharge, somebody who is in a state of tsaras, having the skin eruptions of a metzora, which no longer exists, but that was a physical expression of a spiritual malady. All these kinds of conditions impart tuma, and the vessel could become tameh. And since, the idolaters don't care whether there's tuma or not, their vessels are likely tameh because they've come into contact with these kinds of substances. And therefore, any of our, something that we would want to eat, like oil, that was stored in their vessel, we have to assume that it's tameh. And so now the next question is, well, so what? So what if it's tameh? Priests cannot eat teruma when it's tameh. But priests can eat food that is not teruma when either the priest or the food is tameh. And a regular Jew is very often tameh. Nowadays, all of us are assumed to be tameh because we don't know where the bodies are buried around the world. But what difference does it make that the vessel is tameh? Right, so the fact that we have to assume that the vessel of an idolater has imparted tuma to whatever liquid was inside it, that doesn't mean that it was used for idolatry, which would render it prohibited. Being ritually impure does not render a food prohibited unless it's teruma to be eaten by a priest. So let's keep going here, right? So the Gemara asks, is that to say that all people are consumers of only ritually pure substances? It is common practice to eat ritually impure foods. Why should the secretion of impure vessels, right, the fact that there's residue of impurity in those vessels, render the oil of idolaters prohibited? So the Gemara amends Shmuel's statement and says, rather, the secretion of prohibited vessels prohibits the oil, as it absorbs the prohibited substances. So not just that it was tameh, but perhaps that it contained, some kind of pork fat, for example, right? Just some food or lobster bisque, right? Something that is totally unkosher that a Jew could not eat, and that those prohibited substances will add some of that residue to the oil because, non-Jews they should enjoy lobster. They should enjoy pork chops. There's no reason for them not to eat those foods. We can't eat those foods. So if we were to eat oil that was stored in a vessel belonging to an idolater, it could easily come into contact with those prohibited substances, and therefore we're going to prohibit all oil that was in the possession of the idolaters. Shmuel said to Rav, granted, according to my opinion, as I say that the secretion of prohibited vessels prohibits the oil, this is how one can understand that when Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta came, he said that Rabbi Simlai taught in Netzivin, with regard to oil, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and his court were counted, i.e. they voted on this matter, and they permitted it. They permitted it. So perhaps because oil is a very expensive substance, it's quite valuable, and the idolaters wanted to be able to sell oil to the Jews, they would be careful to make sure that the oil was only ever stored in containers that only ever held oil, so that they could, in a trustworthy manner, say to a Jew who wanted to buy the oil, this is pure oil. It's never come into contact with anything other than a jug that only ever held olive oil in it, so you can have it. And it sounds like the court of Rebbe, under those kinds of conditions, permitted the Jews to buy oil from their neighbors. Shmuel elaborates, it can be explained that Rebbe holds a prohibited substance that imparts flavor to the detriment of the mixture is permitted. So interesting, he's not even saying that we can reliably hold that this oil in the vessels of idolaters never came into contact with a prohibited substance. We can't make such an assumption, but If it did come into that kind of contact, we would taste it, and as long as the flavor of the oil is diminished by these prohibited substances, it's such a small amount that it's going to be nullified. If the residue of those prohibited substances added to the flavor of the oil, improved the flavor of the oil, then it would have it would be a meaningful ingredient in the oil, and that would render it prohibited. Right, very interesting ruling there. But according to you, Rav, who said that, now going way back, Daniel in the book of Daniel, right, first temple period, or between the temples, who said that Daniel decreed a prohibition upon the oil of idolaters. So then how can this be understood? How could Rebbe permit something that had been prohibited for centuries before him, and prohibited by the greatest scholar of the generation at the biblical level, right? Daniel is the book of Daniel. I mean, he's just, remember that the further back we go in time, the closer we come to the original law as it was given at Mount Sinai from God to Moses to the people. And that's why earlier rulings have more authority than later rulings. So if Daniel prohibited the oil of idolaters, how could Rebbe centuries later come and permit it? How's that even possible? That's the question now. According to you, Rav, who said that Daniel decreed a prohibition upon the oil of idolaters, how can this be understood? Can it be said that Daniel decreed it and Rebbe came and voided the decree? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah in Tractate Eduyos, chapter 1, verse Mishnah 5, that a court cannot void the statements of another court unless the later court is greater than the earlier court in both wisdom and in number. Number meaning number of judges on that panel. So according to Rav, how could Rebbe, aka Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, void a decree that was issued earlier by Daniel? So rather than answering Shmuel's question directly, Rav first interjects his proof. And Rav said to him, was it Rabbi Simlai of Lod, of whom you spoke? Residents of Lod are different, as they disparage the sage's decrees, and therefore Rabbi Simlai's testimony is unreliable. Shmuel said to him, shall I send for him? And as a result, Rav became embarrassed. So Rav claimed that Rebbe and his court made a mistake in permitting the oil of the idolaters, because Daniel had prohibited it centuries earlier. So Rav said, if they, Rebbe and his court, did not expound the following verse, will we not expound it? We must certainly expound this verse, for isn't it written in Daniel 1:8? But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine which he drank, mishtav. And the word mishtav is in the plural, indicating that the verse speaks of two types of drinking. One is the drinking of wine, and the other is the drinking of oil. So accordingly, Daniel himself refrained from consuming the oil of idolaters. Right? And who are the idolaters in Daniel's time? That's Nebuchadnezzar, right? He had been exiled after the destruction of the first temple in the Babylonian exile, and then he became an important personage in the kingdom and in the court even of King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he said to himself, okay, sort of on behalf of the Jewish people, it's valuable that I have an important, prominent position, in the government over here, because I can advocate for the safety of my people. But I'm not going to eat non-kosher food while I'm serving in the palace, so to speak. So accordingly, Daniel himself refrained from consuming the oil of idolaters as he instituted this prohibition. So now, why does Shmuel reject this inference, which indicates that Daniel issued this decree? And the Gemara explains that Rav maintained Daniel placed the prohibition against consuming the oil of idolaters upon his heart, i.e. for himself. And he instructed all Jews to adhere to it as well. And Shmuel held Daniel placed the prohibition upon his heart, but he did not instruct all Jews to accept it. It was a stringency that he took on, but not a law that he decreed upon the Jewish people. Now, the Gemara explains that Rav no, I said that. So the Gemara asks, and is it correct that Daniel decreed that oil is prohibited? But doesn't Balei say that Avimi of Nota says in the name of Rav, the prohibition of idolaters' bread, right? The bread of idolaters also prohibited, and their oil, and their wine, and their daughters are all from the 18 matters decreed in a single day in the days of the students of Shammai and Hillel. So apparently Rav himself maintains that the prohibition was not instituted by Daniel. Actually, this prohibition came later. It was a rabbinic decree that was issued, right, in order to protect us from coming to violate Torah laws, but it's much later in history than Daniel in the Bible. Rather, this was the late Second Temple period when we're talking about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and they came together and agreed on 18 matters, which were important restrictions and stringencies on the Jewish people, which they issued and then became part of halacha. And they included this prohibition on what? The bread, the oil, the wine, and the daughters of idolaters. Now, it's more specific than the list initially sounds like. What exactly are we talking about? The Gemara adds, and if you would say that Daniel came and decreed, but the people did not accept it, and later the students of Hillel and Shammai came and decreed with regard to the oil of the idolaters, and then the people accepted it, if that is so, what is the significance of Rav's testimony that Daniel initially instituted the prohibition? And the Gemara explains, rather, Daniel decreed upon the oil of the idolaters in the city. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that it is prohibited even in the field. So there was already an existing prohibition on the oil of idolaters for consumption, perhaps okay to benefit, but prohibited to consume, but not in all situations from the time of Daniel, apparently in the city, but not in the field. And now Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai expanded that prohibition to include the oil of idolaters in all locations. So the Gemara asks, and how could Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi permit an ordinance issued by the students of Shammai and Hillel? Right? Again, it's not as all the way back in biblical times, First Temple period of Daniel, but Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai is certainly long before Rebbe, right? Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, late Second Temple period. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. Rebbe redacts the Mishnah about the year 200. So it's at least, 130, maybe 150 years later. How could Rebbe permit something that had been prohibited by an earlier court? Same issue, right? Later courts can't overrule the rulings of earlier courts unless they're greater in both wisdom and number. So what's going on here? Right, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that a court cannot void the statements of another court unless it is greater than it in wisdom and in number? And furthermore, doesn't Rabbi Bar Chana say that Rabbi Yochanan says with regard to all issues, a court can void the statements of another court except for the 18 matters decreed by the students of Beis Shammai together with Beis Hillel, as even if Elijah, right, the prophet Elijah, who never died and who brings us communications from heaven in various ways at various times, even if Elijah and his court were to come and rescind these 18 matters, no one would listen to him, right? Those 18 matters passed by Beis Shammai in the company of Beis Hillel. Those became universally accepted halachas by the Jewish people, never to be rescinded, at least not until Mashiach comes. So what's going on? So Rav Masharshia said, what is the reason that none of the 18 decrees can be voided? Since the prohibition spread among the majority of the Jewish people, it cannot be voided, right? Very interesting requirement here that when a sage or a court of the sages issues a rabbinic ordinance, it has to actually be accepted by the Jewish people. They might have a really good reason to issue a rabbinic decree to protect the people from coming to violate Torah laws, written Torah laws, But if the people don't accept those ordinances issued by the sages, they don't acquire the force of law. So there is a bit of a popular democracy at work here, although the people don't vote on laws. But if the sages issue a decree and it doesn't take hold among the Jewish people, then it does not acquire the force of halacha, the force of law. And let's read more about that. Right? Since the prohibition spread, this earlier one of Beis Shammai did spread among the majority of the Jewish people, it cannot be voided. But with regard to oil, its prohibition did not spread among the majority of the Jewish people, and therefore it could be voided. As Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, our sages sat and inspected the matter of the oil of idolaters, and they determined that its prohibition had not spread among the majority of the Jewish people. And our sages relied upon the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and upon the statement of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, who would say the sages issue a decree upon the community only if most of the community is able to abide by it. As Rav Ada bar Ahava said, what is the verse from which it is derived? And now we're on page 36b. It is the verse, you are cursed with the curse, yet you rob me, meaning God is speaking, even this whole nation. That's from Malachi 3:9. So this teaches that if there is the acceptance of the whole nation, yes, an ordinance may be instituted, but if not, no, the ordinance may not be instituted by the sages. Now, the Gemara discusses the matter itself. Balei, this is a sage, Balei says that Avimi of Nota says in the name of Rav, the prohibitions with regard to the bread of idolaters and their oil, their wine, and their daughters are all from these 18 matters issued in a single day in the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel. So, the Gemara asks, with regard to their daughters, what is the decree? And Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak says, they decreed upon their daughters, upon the daughters of the idolaters, that they should be classified as menstruating women from the time that they are in their cradle, as they decreed that from when they are young, idolatrous women are always considered to be menstruating. Now, what does that mean? First of all, Jewish men are not permitted, as we'll see today, by the strongest possible prohibition, are not permitted to marry non-Jewish women, and even more, are not permitted to touch and to cohabit with non-Jewish women. It's a different prohibition in itself, but both of these matters are entirely prohibited. So why would they also say that all women who are not Jewish are considered to be menstruating women? What does menstruating mean? Now, this is interesting because the idea of tuma and tahara, right, ritual impurity and ritual purity, only applies to Jews, right? The Torah does not decree tuma, and the idea, that if you come into contact with the corpse, now you become tameh and you can't enter the holy temple until you've been sprinkled with the waters of purification that include the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd day and the 7th day, and then you immerse in the mikveh, and then you wait for nightfall, and then you would have been, purified from the impurity of the dead, and then you'd be permitted to enter the holy temple, right? But if a non-Jew comes into contact with a corpse because he helps bury, a relative in the cemetery, he does not become tameh. He does not become tameh because tuma doesn't apply to non-Jews. Another way of acquiring tuma is that you come into contact with a woman who is menstruating, right? You don't become tameh just because you touch a woman who's not your wife. You can, that incidental contact, something to be avoided, but it doesn't do anything to you unless she's a menstruating woman. Then you would become tameh, and to become tahor again, you have to immerse in a mikveh and await nightfall. So what does it mean that they're going to say that all women of the idolaters from when they're kids are considered like menstruating women? It's not that they are menstruating women. Obviously, they're not always menstruating. But what we're doing is by considering them like that, and that coming into contact with them would render you tameh, And therefore, if you were a priest, you couldn't eat teruma. If you were going to the Holy Temple, you're not going to be allowed to enter the temple. You're going to have to go through a purification process, right? It's making like a metaphor that they are like menstruating women. But what it means, legally speaking, is that you would become tameh if you come into contact with them. And what is the effect of this? Separates the communities, right? They're very much going to issue decrees that keep the Jews away from the idolaters. Why? Remember, we've already read earlier in this book that, number one, idolaters practice idolatry. And idolatry in the ancient world was very enticing. And we want to keep the Jews, the sages want to keep the Jews away from idolatry because it's a big sin. Number two, the way idolatry was practiced in the ancient world often had all kinds of sexual, orgiastic types of practices associated with it. Very enticing. They wanted to keep the Jews away from all of that. They'd want the Jews not to intermarry with the idolaters. So there's all these policies that are passed just to keep the community separate. And if all those reasons that I've given weren't enough, also the idolaters at that time, since October 7th, maybe this hits home a little more closely than it did before, were dangerous. They were literally, physically dangerous. They were always suspected of bloodshed. They hated Jews. If they could kill a Jew and get away with it, they often would. And so just keeping Jews away from idolaters was a way to preserve Jewish life. So for all these reasons, they issued these decrees to keep the Jews away from the idolaters. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says they decreed upon their daughters that they should be classified as menstruating women from the time they are in their cradle. Now the Gemara presents a different opinion. And Geneva says, in the name of Rav, that the bread, oil, wine, and daughters of the idolaters were all decreed upon due to the concern that Jews might participate in idolatry with the idolaters as a result of intermingling with them, right? To protect Jews from coming to commit idolatry. As when Rabbi Acha bar Ada came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yitzchak says they decreed a prohibition upon their bread due to their oil. Interesting. And the Gemara asks, in what way is the prohibition with regard to oil stronger than the prohibition with regard to bread? That is, why does the primary concern relate to the oil of the idolaters rather than their bread? What is more harmful or dangerous to a Jew about the oil of idolaters compared to the bread of idolaters? And the Gemara offers a different interpretation. Right? It doesn't answer the question. It says, oh, maybe we're wrong. And says instead, rather, they issued a decree prohibiting their bread and their oil due to their wine. And they issued a decree prohibiting their wine due to the fact that this leads to familiarity. And if there's familiarity between the Jews and the idolaters, Jewish men will come to marry their daughters, which is the great no-no. And they issued a decree prohibiting their daughters due to something else. And what was this something else? Idolatry, right? That the whole thing is to protect the Jews from coming to commit idolatry. They don't go out like, I want to commit idolatry, but they might start, just by having some bread with their friends who are not Jewish. Then they get familiar. Then they drink wine. Then they get together and do what people do. And then they end up married and committing idolatry, right? So to stop all of that, they made these decrees. Idolatry. And they further issued a decree on something else due to something else, which will be explained by the Gemara. Very interesting, right? So they decreed all those things to stop intermarriage, and there was a further reason that they decreed on something else to stop something else. What does that mean? The question we should be asking is, why are they being so ambiguous? Why the euphemism, right? It means that they have trouble talking about something. They'd rather not talk about something so unseemly in the study hall, but they want to make sure that it doesn't happen. And everyone who's kind of in the know knows what that thing is, but nobody wants to say it out loud. We'll come back around to it. It was stated that the prohibition against marrying the daughters of the idolaters was decreed on account of idolatry, because the Jew who does such a thing will end up committing idolatry. So the Gemara raised an objection. But the prohibition against marrying their daughters is prescribed by Torah law. Why would you say that you need to stop Jewish men from marrying non-Jewish women, or in this case, idolatrous women, in order to stop those Jewish men from committing the sin of idolatry? It's bad enough that they're just marrying non-Jews. The Torah says Jewish men have to marry Jews. It's prohibited to marry a non-Jew. Why do you want to say that they're prohibited to marry non-Jews? Because it will lead to something else. It's strictly already prohibited just to marry a non-Jew. How do we know that? As it is written, neither shall you make marriages with them. Deuteronomy 7:3. Your sons cannot marry the daughters of the non-Jews. And the Gemara explains, by Torah law, intermarriage is prohibited, but who's the them in Deuteronomy 7:3? Not all non-Jews, but the 7 Canaanite nations that were being displaced at the time that Joshua is going to lead the children of Israel into the Holy Land, and they're going to, wage war and then rid the land of those particular idolaters who are not only so steeped in the sin of idolatry, but were also practicing child sacrifice and all kinds of terrible things that God said, that's it. The land is going to vomit out these people. And you, the Jewish people who are now going to replace them in the Holy Land, you must not do any of the practices that the Canaanite nations were doing. And so one way that God is making sure that doesn't happen is by prohibiting Jewish men to marry Canaanite women. Now that doesn't, but the Torah has not said, and you may never marry a non-Jew. Here it's only said specifically, you may not marry a woman from the Canaanite nations. So how are we going to extend that to all non-Jews? Let's keep reading. By Torah law, intermarriage is prohibited only with the 7 Canaanite nations, but intermarriage with the other nations of the world is not prohibited, again, by written Torah law. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that intermarriage is prohibited, even with the other nations, right? So again, we've already read that those 18 decrees that Beis Shammai issued, right, in conjunction with Beis Hillel in that period, late Second Temple period, those will never be rescinded, right? At least not until Mashiach comes. And so among them is no intermarriage. Jewish man not permitted under Jewish law to marry a non-Jewish woman. Is a Jewish woman permitted to marry a non-Jewish man? No. No, but we haven't spoken specifically about that yet. Now, the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who says at the subsequent verse, for he will turn away your son from following me, in the next verse, Deuteronomy 7:4, this serves to include all people who turn away one's son from God, i.e., all non-Jewish women. So then, what is there to say? Wasn't it already written in the Torah? Why do we have to wait for Beis Shammai to declare it 1,000 years later? So rather, by Torah law, only sexual relations by way of marriage are prohibited, and they came and decreed that sexual relations are prohibited even by way of licentiousness. Right? So interesting, like we know where Jewish law ends up is you're only allowed to have sex within marriage. And you're only allowed to marry somebody who will not turn your heart away from God. Therefore, you can't marry idolaters and you can't have sex with idolaters even before marriage. But it sounds like maybe the Torah only said you can't marry them, and then Beis Shammai came along and said, and you just can't have sex with them, period. Probably that was already prohibited and well understood, but they formalized that prohibition, according to this view. The Gemara objects to this. No, that's not what they decreed that day. Licentious sexual intercourse was also prohibited earlier. They didn't come along to prohibit that. That was already prohibited. As they decreed a prohibition in this regard in the court of Shem. As it is written, Shem. Now, who's Shem? Shem is one of the sons of Noah, right? Noah and the ark, as in Noah and the ark. This is before Jews. Before Jews. Already, right, the 3 sons of Noah, right, and one of them was Shem, who sort of became the prototypical Torah teacher before the Torah was ever given, but he was already transmitting the knowledge of God that God gave to Noah and Noah gave to Shem. And later, many generations later, we know that Jacob when he ran away from from his father's house, from Yitzhak's house, after the incident of getting the blessing from his father in place of his brother Esau, and then he ends up spending 20 years in the household of his his uncle, right? Of his uncle, and then he's going to marry his cousins, right? Rachel and Leah. But before he arrives in Lavan's house, there's a missing 14 years. And what did he do for those 14 years? He studied in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. That's a very, very common and well-known midrash. And this is the Shem that we're talking about. So what they're saying is, going all the way back to the immediate generation right after the flood, it was known by humankind that you can only have sex in marriage. But that, wanton sex, licentious sex just for fun, prohibited. And everybody knows that. That is one of the Noahide commandments. That's not just a commandment on Jews, that's a commandment on all people. As it is written, and now how do we know this? Because before the Torah was given, we're going to look at the incident of Judah and Tamar. It was told to Judah, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. And moreover, behold, she is with child by harlotry. And Judah said, bring her forth and let her be burned. Genesis 38:24. Long before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, before the sons of Jacob became the tribes, became enslaved in Egypt, and then came out of Egypt and received the Torah at Mount Sinai, long before that, you have in the period of Jacob's sons themselves, the incident with Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, and she is supposed to be waiting, for his third son because, her husband died, and then she married his brother and he died, and now they're waiting for Judah's third son to marry her, but Judah doesn't want to give up his third son to this woman, and so she ends up playing a trick, very interesting trick in Genesis 38, where she ends up getting pregnant by Judah himself by pretending to be a harlot. She actually had a right to marry Judah because he was the closest kin who was available to do yibum, right? The mitzvah, the commandment of building up your brother's house. Or in those days, it wasn't only limited to the brother because the Torah hadn't been given yet. But the point is that in the context of that story, having sex outside of marriage was a big sin, and it was a reason to expel this woman or even impose a death sentence on her, because it was well known to everybody that kind of thing was prohibited for a married woman. This proves that the prohibition against licentious intercourse with a non-Jew was in force long before the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel. So the Gemara now explains, rather, the prohibition that was prescribed by Torah law applies to the case of an idolater who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman. Right, now we're talking about a Jewish woman and an idolater man, as she is drawn after him toward idolatry. Since we said that you can't marry someone who will pull you toward idolatry, this would also cover the case of a Jewish woman and a male idolater, as she is drawn after him toward idolatry. But the case of a Jew, meaning a Jewish man, who engaged in intercourse with a female idolater is not included in the prohibition by Torah law, and the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that the prohibition applies even to a Jewish man who engaged in intercourse with an idolatrous woman and not for the purpose of marriage. So the Gemara rejects this whole analysis. The prohibition concerning a Jew who engaged in intercourse with a non-Jewish woman who's an idolater, this is a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai. It was already prohibited, and it was prohibited at the earliest possible juncture when the Torah was being given at Mount Sinai. As we know, at Mount Sinai, there was the written Torah was given, right? Moses took dictation and wrote down the Torah that we still have today. And we also had the core of the oral tradition, which now is embodied here in the Mishnah and the Gemara. And many rabbinic decrees have been instituted over the centuries and millennia since. But there were also certain oral laws given by God to Moses, right? And the sort of most famous example is the tefillin that we wear, because the written Torah only says that you shall bind these words as a sign upon your hand and be a symbol before your eyes. How do you fulfill that commandment? God showed Moses the black box, the leather straps, how they would be constructed, and we have always understood that to be one of the laws, one of the traditions transmitted by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. So the idea that Jewish men cannot have sex with idolatrous women and certainly cannot marry them goes all the way back, according to this tradition, to Moses at Mount Sinai. And it is not a rabbinic ordinance at all, right? It's direct law from God, one of the core laws of the oral tradition. As the master said, with regard to one who engages in intercourse with an Aramaean woman, zealots may attack him, as Pinchas did to Zimri in the wilderness in Numbers 25, verses 6 and 8, which we read about 2 weeks ago in our annual cycle of the Torah. He said to him, by Torah law, intercourse with an idolater is prohibited in public, and only in situations like the incident that occurred with Cosbi and Zimri when Pinchas the Zealot came and killed them both and stopped the plague that God was putting on Jewish people, as described in Numbers 25. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that the prohibition applies even in private. It's not just that you can't make a public spectacle of having sex with a non-Jewish woman. You're prohibited, period. And it was that additional prohibition that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel issued, more than 1,000 years later. So the Gemara raises another difficulty. This was also prohibited in private, as the court of the Hasmoneans decreed that it is prohibited. The court of the Hasmoneans, right? That's after the time of the Hanukkah story in the Second Temple period. As when Rav Dimi came to the land of Israel from Bavel, he said the court of the Hasmoneans decreed that a Jew who engaged in intercourse with a female idolater bears liability for transgressing 4 prohibitions. Not only is it prohibited for a Jewish man to have sexual relations with a non-Jewish woman, an idolatress, he violates 4 prohibitions with 1 act. And this is represented by the mnemonic Nun Shin Gimel Aleph. These letters stand for the menstruating woman, Nida, because that was decreed on all non-Jewish women. The maidservant, as we'll understand, Shivcha. The Gentile, right, the non-Jewish woman. And the married woman, an Eshes Ish. By rabbinic law, a man who engages in intercourse with a non-Jewish woman is considered to have violated the prohibitions involved in having intercourse with all 4 of these women. It's like committing idolatry. It's like coming into contact with a menstruating woman. It's like having, sex with a maidservant that's prohibited. And it's a simple prohibition, even if she's not an idolater, of just any non-Jewish woman. And when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, I just said that? No, again. He bears liability for 4 prohibitions represented by the mnemonic Nun Shin Gimel Zayin. Different mnemonic, which stands for menstruating woman, maidservant, the Gentile, and the prostitute, right? He exchanges, it's like adultery. He says, no, it's like having sex with a prostitute. Zona. And in any case, it is apparent that this decree was in force before the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel. They couldn't decree that it was now prohibited for Jewish men to have sex with non-Jewish women because it was already prohibited with a strong prohibition that in fact violated 4 different prohibitions. So the Gemara answers, when the court of the Hasmoneans decreed, they prohibited only sexual intercourse. But with regard to seclusion with a non-Jewish woman, no, they did not prohibit that. They're not saying it's permitted, but they didn't issue a specific decree on it. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that even seclusion with a non-Jewish woman is prohibited. Right? It's not only prohibited to have sex with her, you can't even be in a situation where the 2 of you are behind closed doors where you could have sexual relations. And the Gemara raised an objection to this. Seclusion was also prohibited earlier, as the court of King David decreed with regard to this matter, that a Jewish man can't be secluded with a non-Jewish woman. As Rav Yehuda says, at that time, after the incident involving Amnon and Tamar, right? Amnon was one of these wayward sons of King David that caused him nothing but grief. They decreed with regard to seclusion, very bad. There was even, I think Amnon was the one who committed incest with his sister, terrible, and then his brother killed him. Awful, really. David suffered because he had, a lot of sons who just caused him terrible, terrible problems. And the sages said in response to the objection, there in David's court, seclusion with a Jewish woman was prohibited. Right? A Jewish man also can't be secluded with a Jewish woman who's not his wife for the same reasons of modesty. But seclusion with a non-Jewish woman was not prohibited. Again, it wasn't that it was permitted, but the law that David's court passed wasn't addressing that issue. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed a prohibition even with regard to seclusion with a non-Jewish woman. So the Gemara raised yet another difficulty. Seclusion with a Jewish woman is prohibited by Torah law. As Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yechotzadak, where is there an allusion in the Torah to the prohibition against seclusion, as it is stated, Deuteronomy 13:7, if your brother, the son of your mother, entices you, and does only a half brother who is the son of a mother entice one to sin, whereas the son of a father does not entice? Rather, there is a greater concern that a maternal half brother might entice one to sin, as a son secludes himself with his mother, and no other may seclude himself with any of those with whom relations are forbidden by the Torah. Since an individual and his maternal half-brother both seclude themselves with their shared mother, they are frequently together in private, and this facilitates the enticement to go commit idolatry because they spend a lot of time together, these two brothers. In any case, it is clear that the prohibition against seclusion with a Jewish woman preceded King David. So if the court of King David issued some kind of a prohibition having to do with seclusion, it couldn't have been that they prohibited a Jewish man secluding himself with a Jewish woman who's not his wife, because that was already prohibited. So if they prohibited anything, it must have been that a Jewish man can't seclude himself with a non-Jewish woman. And the Gemara explains the prohibition against seclusion prescribed by Torah law applies specifically to a married woman, because then it's a risk of adultery, or even suspicion of adultery. And David came and decreed a prohibition even with regard to seclusion with an unmarried woman. And later, the students of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel came and decreed even with regard to seclusion with a non-Jewish woman. So those would be the steps of what the different prohibitions were in each of those eras. It was stated above that they issued a decree prohibiting the daughters of idolaters due to something else. And the something else was idolatry. Okay, they don't want anyone to come near idolatry. And then it said that they further issued a decree on something else due to something else. Right? Euphemistically, just refusing to name this horrible thing that we're trying to avoid, and we don't even want to talk about it. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of? And they further issued a decree on something else due to something else. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says they decreed upon a male child of an idolater that he imparts ritual impurity as though he were a Jew who experienced a gonorrhea-like discharge, so that a Jewish youngster will not become familiar with him, leading to homosexual intercourse. The sages employed a euphemism when referring to this decree. Again, Tuma doesn't apply to non-Jews, but they said that girls, the daughters of idolaters, even from a young age, are considered like menstruating women just to keep them apart from us. And they said that the sons of idolaters are also going to be considered basically like menstruating women, but that's a kind of silly analogy. So instead, they said like a ziv, like a man who has had a seminal discharge, and he now imparts tuma. So they're going to say that, okay, males the sons of idolaters, who tuma doesn't apply to them, but we're going to say legally speaking, they're all tameh, as if they had a seminal discharge, again, to increase the separation between the Jews and the non-Jews. As Rabbi Zera says, I had great trouble with Rabbi Asi when I asked him the following question. And likewise, Rabbi Asi had great trouble with Rabbi Yochanan when he asked the question. And Rabbi Yochanan had trouble with Rabbi Yana, and Rabbi Yana had trouble with Rabbi Nassan ben Amram, and Rabbi Nassan ben Amram had trouble with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And the inquiry was as follows. Right? Nobody wanted to answer the question. The student had to keep asking because it's just so unseemly to talk about, but it's still a matter of law, so they needed to talk about it. What is the law? With regard to a male son of an idolater, with regard to the son of an idolater, but who's a minor, from when, i.e. from what age, does he impart Tuma as one who experiences Ziva? And Rebbe said to me here in this discussion, from when he is 1 day old. Right? We say that they're like, legally speaking, like a Ziv, right, who imparts impurity just like a Nida, from when they're born, basically, from when they're 1 day old. And when I came to Rabbi Chia, he said to me from when he is 9 years and 1 day old. We're not going to say that they impart Tuma, when they're just little tiny kids, but when they become 9 years old. And the other view is any idolater imparts Tuma all the time. Again, these are decrees to keep the Jews and the non-Jews apart. And when I came back and relayed Rabbi Chia's statement before Rebbe, he said to me, discard my statement and grasp the statement of Rabbi Chia, who says, from when does the child of an idolater impart Tuma as one who experiences Ziva? From when he is 9 years and 1 day old. We don't say that younger than that they impart Tuma. Now we're getting a little head start on page 37a. And the Gemara explains the reason for this opinion. Since a 9-year-old boy is fit to engage in intercourse. Are they saying it's permitted for 9-year-olds to have intercourse? No, that is not what it says. And when people like to make accusations about the Talmud, they'll cite a passage like this. What they're saying is, when it's yet younger than that, there's not even a sexual thought in the mind of that child, and it is only abuse, right? Obviously, a minor, if an adult has sex with him, it's abuse. It's rape, it's child rape, it's illegal in every way. And the Talmud says 1,000 times that the law of the land is the law. But when they're saying, from what age is a child fit to have intercourse, what they're really saying is if they have some kind of sexual touching, do we even characterize that as sex? Or is it just purely a different kind of abuse? That matters for a girl because if she's raped lower than a certain age, then even though she experienced rape and the trauma of that, she's still considered a virgin. Whereas if she's older than that and she gets raped, sadly, she's not a virgin anymore. It's not her fault, but she doesn't have the legal status of a virgin. Doesn't mean she can't get married. Any man can marry her. But for certain legal issues, calculating damages, etc., if she's younger than that age, then even though she was abused, she's still a virgin, and older, it's different, right? So it's just a legal question. So again, the reason for this opinion is that since the 9-year-old is fit to engage in that practice, so we call it intercourse if that happens, he also imparts ritual impurity as one who experienced Ziva. Ravina said, therefore, with regard to the female child of the idolater who is 3 years and 1 day old, since if she's touched in this way, it's considered intercourse, we would use that age as the demarcation. The Gemara asks, isn't that obvious? And the Gemara explains, it was necessary to state this ruling, lest you say that the law that an idolater who is suited for intercourse imparts impurity, that this law does not apply to a female. We would say it does, but at a different age. So the possible difference between a male and a female child is based on the fact that whereas that child, the 9-year-old male, knows how to accustom others to sin by employing persuasion, this child, the 3-year-old female, does not know how to accustom others. Now, even the kids at that age don't play, these kinds of games. Obviously, it's innocent. They don't know what they're doing the way an adult does, but there are different behaviors at different stages of childhood. Therefore, Ravina teaches us that the law nevertheless applies to both male and female children. Again, this is not a discussion about child abuse and rape. The discussion is about whether the child of idolaters imparts Tuma when he comes into contact, with Teruma, which normally a non-Jew would not impart Tuma because Tuma and Tahara does not apply to non-Jews. But because these other rulings were issued that say they do impart Tuma as a legal matter to keep Jews and non-Jews separated from each other, then they have to say, well, okay, from when does that law apply, and what would be the rationale for starting it at a certain age or not? The Gemara relates a relevant incident. Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah, the grandson of Rebbe, was traveling while leaning upon the shoulder of Rabbi Simlei, his attendant. And Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah said to him, Simlei, you were not in the study hall last night when we permitted the oil of the idolaters. And Rabbi Simlei said to him, in our days, you will permit bread of the idolaters as well. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said to him, well, if so, people will call us a permissive court. As we learned in a Mishnah in Edu Yosef 4, that Rabbi Yosef ben Yozer of Tzareda testified with regard to the ale kamsa, which is a type of locust, that it is kosher, and with regard to the liquids of the slaughterhouse in the temple, that they are ritually pure, right? The blood that goes on the ground when offerings are slaughtered in the temple to be brought on the altar, that blood doesn't have the same status as blood in the butcher house. That they are ritually pure, and with regard to one who touches a corpse, that he is impure, as will soon be explained by the Gemara. And as a result, they called him Yosef the Permissive. Those laws have nothing to do with our discussion. It's just this idea of, can a later court permit something that an earlier court prohibited? If they do it, maybe because they have, that court is greater in wisdom, greater in number, and something has changed in the world, and they issue this permit on something that was previously prohibited, well, they better not do that very often. Right? And so what they're saying here in the note is a court can do that once, maybe twice, definitely not 3 times in the entire lifetime of that court. Rabbi Simlei said to him, there, Yosef ben Yozer permitted 3 matters, but the master has permitted only 1. And even if the master permits 1 other matter, these still will constitute only 2 permissive rulings. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said to him, I've already permitted another matter. And the Gemara asks, what is the other matter that he permitted? Again, reversing an older prohibition. So the Gemara explains that this is, as we learned in the Mishnah tractate Gittin, that if one says to his wife, this is your bill of divorce if I do not arrive from now until 12 months' time, and then he died within 12 months, then it is not a valid bill of divorce because it would not take effect until after the husband's death. And it is taught with regard to that Mishnah that our rabbis nevertheless permitted her to marry. Right? This is all to help women from having the aguna issue, that, you know, if this husband goes to war and he goes missing in action and no one can testify that they saw him die, so he never comes back, but they can't prove that he died, and so she can never remarry. So to avoid that problem, these soldiers would give their wives a bill of divorce, but it's a conditional bill of divorce that basically says, if I don't come back by a certain date, then you're divorced. But the key is, if the divorce only takes hold later than the time that he actually died, well, then she's already a widow. She can't become a divorcee. Since we're not sure if she's a widow or not, we're not sure if she's a divorcee or not, and she's still stuck. So the legal requirements for these conditional bills of divorce was very strict, right? It was saying that if I don't come back by a certain date, you are divorced as of today when I'm giving this to you. Right, so it will take effect from today, so that she would be a divorcee prior to the date when maybe this guy dies. Again, terrible situation. Nobody should ever be in that situation. But it was to protect women from coming to be stuck and unable to remarry that they issued, you know, a kind of adaptation of the existing law. Right, and so. Right, so this is your bill of divorce if I do not arrive from now until 12 months' time. But he didn't say, this is your divorce from now, if I do not arrive by. The wording was wrong. This is not a valid bill of divorce. But it is taught with regard to the Mishnah that our rabbis nevertheless permitted her to marry because it's clear that that's what they wanted to achieve. They just spoke it wrong. So the Gemara continues, and we say, who is the Mishnah referring to when it mentions our rabbis? This is referring to Rav Shmuel. Rav Shmuel said this is referring to the court that permitted the oil of the idolaters. And tangentially, the Gemara examines the reason for the ruling of Rebbe's court concerning the bill of divorce. They hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says the date written in a document proves when it takes effect. In other words, the bill of divorce takes effect at the time written on it. It was dated from when he gave it to her, even if he spoke the formula wrong. Therefore, the divorce actually goes into effect before the husband's death, let's say in that foreign battle, because it retroactively initiated on the day that the bill was issued. And the Gemara adds, and Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, says in an earlier period, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi also ruled that the bill of divorce should be valid, but the other sages did not concede to his opinion during his entire lifetime. And some say that all of his colleagues did not concede to his opinion, but maybe they conceded later. Rabbi Lazar said to a certain elderly man who was a member of Rebbe's court, when you permitted this woman to remarry, did you permit her immediately after the husband died, as he certainly will not arrive within 12 months, or perhaps you permitted her only after 12 months because only then is the condition fulfilled? Now, let's say that they do know that he died, and people can testify that he died, but she's already received this bill of divorce. So she would be divorced prior to the guy dying because his death is what triggers that bill of divorce to be good, to be valid retroactively. This also has the effect that Yibum does not apply, right? Because maybe if Yibum applies and they didn't have children together and the husband left a brother, but the brother is somewhere overseas. So again, she's stuck. She can't remarry until she either performs Yibum or Chalitza with that brother because of the law of levirate marriage. But if she's divorced, there's no levirate marriage, she's free to remarry. That's another reason why they would have instituted this policy. The elderly man said to Rabbi Lazar, and let the dilemma be raised with regard to the Mishnah itself, as we learned in the next line of the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin. If one says to his wife, this is your bill of divorce from now, if I do not arrive from now until 12 months have elapsed, and he died within 12 months, this is a valid bill of divorce. And the reason is that its condition was fulfilled, as the husband stated explicitly that the bill takes effect immediately. And he explains, and let the dilemma be raised with regard to this case. Is the bill of divorce valid immediately upon the husband's death because he will certainly not arrive? Or perhaps the bill of divorce is valid only after the 12 months have elapsed because only then was the condition fulfilled. Right? It says it's your bill of divorce from now if I don't come home in 12 months. Now, once they know he's dead, they know he's not coming back in 12 months. But maybe she still can't marry until the 12 months have elapsed. So Rabbi Lazar answered, yes, it is indeed so. This question can be asked with regard to the case of the Mishnah itself. And the Gemara adds, but Rabbi Lazar asked that elder about the decision of Rabbi Yehuda in Nasiya's court because he was present at that assembly and therefore he could report on what had actually occurred. Abaye says, all concede that one who says that a bill of divorce will take effect once the sun emerges from its sheath, like when the sun rises in the morning, is saying to his wife that it will be valid once the sun comes out in the morning. And therefore, if the husband dies during the night before sunrise, the get didn't take effect because she became a widow before the divorce could take hold. Furthermore, if he said to her, on the condition that the sun will come out of its sheath, then he is saying to his wife that the bill of divorce will take effect retroactively from now, on the condition that the sun rises in the morning. And accordingly, if he dies during the night, this is certainly a fulfilled condition, and it is a bill of divorce which takes effect retroactively because the sun did rise later. Doesn't matter that he saw it or not. And while he is alive, in accordance with the statement of Rav Huna. As Rav Huna says, it took effect while he was alive. As Rav Huna says, with regard to anyone who states a provision employing the language of on the condition that, this is tantamount to his stating in the provision that the document takes effect retroactively from now. Again, we're pretty far afield from whether the oil and bread of idolaters is permitted or not and why. We've gone on a digression having to do with bills of divorce, and that's why we're not going to get too into depth on the law of divorce. We're really here tangentially. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in now. So they disagreed only in the case of one who said to his wife, this will be your bill of divorce if the sun emerges from its sheath, and the husband died during the night. And Rebbe holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says that the date written in the document proves when it takes effect, and it is therefore considered as though the husband said, from today if I die, or as though he said, from now if I die. And the sages do not accept the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, and consequently they maintain that it is considered as though the husband said only, this is your bill of divorce if I die, in which case the bill of divorce is not valid, as it would take effect only after the husband's death, and at that time, she's a widow, she can't get a divorce. That's where we'll stop, take a few questions, pick it up tomorrow. Yosef, will the Messiah, repeal certain ordinances? Well, we don't know. He might. I mean, he'll have the power to do that because he'll be God's direct representative on earth, who is going to change the very nature of the world when God's presence will be revealed throughout the world. It won't take faith to believe in God. We'll all be experiencing God's presence constantly. And in such a world, certain decrees may well not be necessary. It might even be counterproductive. And so he'll have the power to rescind those decrees. Do we know that certain decrees will be rescinded in the Messianic age? I mean, we have teachings elsewhere in the Gemara that say that a lot of the holiday laws will be rescinded. We won't celebrate them the way we do now, except for Purim. Purim we will always celebrate the way we do now, even in the Messianic age. Sharon, can a non-Jew who came into contact with a dead body, can a non-Jew who came into contact with a dead body, but not Tameh, because he's not Tameh, enter the Holy Temple to offer a sacrifice? Since we know that non-Jews could offer sacrifices, did they enter the temple? Wonderful question. If we're saying that idolaters are all, have the status of being Tameh, like a Nida or a Ziva, then why would we allow them into the temple to bring their sacrifices? I suspect that when we say that they have that status, it's with regard to if we come into contact with them. But they aren't actually Tameh, because Tumah doesn't apply to non-Jews, so maybe they could enter, but it's a great question, and I don't know the answer offhand. Joe, all of the restrictions are to keep the community from even starting down the path to idolatry. It's easier to stop early rather than further down the road. Exactly, right? The slippery slope theory, the broken windows theory, same idea. Among other reasons, perhaps the statute for a Jewish man not to marry a non-Jew is a kindness to keep Jewish women protected, nourished, and comforted with the blessings that Hashem gave to the Jewish men. Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially, in ancient times, right? As we see in the book of Ruth, to be a single woman without the protection of a man was really very difficult. There were some women who could do it, right? The great judge, Devorah, was a ruler in Israel, like they had the equivalent of a king. So you could function as a single woman. It was very, very difficult, right? And so certainly it would protect a Jewish woman to be married to a Jewish man. But it's also more than that, right? Because if you marry not Jewish, you're just not going to live a Jewish Torah life. And once you're, moving away from Torah, where are you going to move to? The practices of the neighbors, who in that time and place were all idolaters, so you'd end up committing the terrible and grievous sin of idolatry. Bill, but surely if David's court ruled that a Jewish man cannot be secluded with a Jewish woman, Kal v'chomer would entail that said court also intended to prohibit seclusion as a whole. I think that's a good analysis, but we have to be careful about ordinances derived from other ordinances by Kal v'chomer, right? They derive ordinances from written laws. If such and such, then how much more such and such, where the Kal v'chomer creates a rabbinic ordinance, right? But you can't make ordinances upon ordinances, so that's something we have to be very careful about. Bell, the last question, I read that at the horrible time of 9/11, Jewish men were sending gets of this kind to their wives by fax, in the knowledge that these men were doomed. Oh my God, like a Cantor Fitzgerald, right, at the top of the World Trade Center, and they knew they were going to die, and that their bodies could be lost in the wreckage of the World Trade Center, never found, unless the wife be stuck in that situation. They issued just this kind of a get. I had not heard that story. Oh, it's so awful. That's so awful that people went through that. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, regular Wednesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.